The name of this session is Five Benefits of Positional Calling and One Challenge. My plan is literally to go through the five benefits. They are not the only benefits, they are benefits that I picked because they're benefits that are important to me. Um, but there are others. And so part of what I think we can do in this session is actually, if you all have experienced positional calling and you're interested in talking about benefits that you've experienced, I'd love to hear them. Um, and then I do want to talk about the challenge because I think that although obviously some of you know already, I'm a big fan and advocate of positional calling. I think it's disingenuous to pretend that there are no challenges involved. So, benefit number one is a phrase that I stole from Brooke. I did not know that Brooke would be the moderator when I did this, but this is the phrase that first caught my attention when I started to think about gender-free calling. Um, and it's because it wasn't about gender, it was about dancing well. And so Brooke and Chris Sackett came up with this phrase to describe their goals for global terminology, which is almost a synonym for positional calling, although it has a slightly different emphasis, I think. However, global terminology was my introduction to the concept of calling positionally. And they came up with the term as a way to teach and call that encourages dancers and callers and choreographers to approach the dance as a pattern and as a whole. So each dancer is not just a person dancing a track on their own with some other people who happen to be also dancing tracks. Instead, you're all dancing together. And I think that's so important. To some of you, that seems obvious that we work together to create a dance, that the dance is the larger thing made up of individual dancers. But to others, that might be a new idea. A lot of us are used to thinking of dances as things that we do with a partner. You know, ask someone to dance. Okay, we're dancing together, and there are other people, but we don't necessarily think about the whole set as our partners. And we can when we think about dancing the whole dance. Even when we sometimes think about the whole set, we might think about covering when we're doing a back to back. We're not encouraged by the language of calling to think about ourselves as invested in that whole pattern. I think it's a slightly more intuitive idea for callers. When we think about choreography and we watch the floor, we're often watching a pattern, not an individual. And so that outsider status can help us see the pattern. But my experience is that when dancers think about themselves as part of a pattern, they dance better, they learn faster. There are all kinds of benefits to this. So, benefit one of positional calling really is the way that it encourages the caller to teach the dancers to dance the whole dance. Benefit number two, there are no assumptions about gender in positional calling. It takes gender out of the equation. And when we do that, partnering choices are freed from the expectations or prejudices of heteronormativity. This is something that's important to me personally as a not straight dancer, as someone who enjoys dancing both roles. But it's also been important to a huge number of groups that I've taught. I used to work very closely with our university group before the pandemic, and they were the ones that first approached me to think about calling gender free. And it wasn't because of any question of sexuality, it was because they wanted to dance with their friends, and they felt like the terms gents and ladies, which I had been using as their primary caller, were not conducive to asking same gender friends to dance. It set the expectation that couples would be opposite gender. And none of them, I mean, they didn't not want to do it, but they didn't just want to do it. So they said, can't we find language that's different? And we actually started out using alternative role terms. We used chutes and ladders because the students voted on that. But then ultimately, I shifted to positional calling, in part because I started working with another group in London here in the UK. And there it was a bunch of older men who were uncomfortable dancing together because they said, we don't want to ask another man to be addressed as a lady. They felt uncomfortable with that. And so they felt like asking another man to dance was inviting an awkward conversation that they wanted to avoid. And so I said, okay, forget these. Like, they were never going to go. If I was like, let's use Larks and Robbins, they would look at me like I was nuts. And so I said, let's just go with global terminology. Let's think about positional calling. And we switched to that. So making no assumptions about gender solves a whole bunch of problems, problems that I would never have predicted were even on the floor as a caller necessarily. And I think that's really important. I also think, though, that it is important because of who is on the floor. When you change role terms, What we retain is a very binary sense of the dance. So, a conversation that was really powerful for me recently is there was a whole debate about the word partner. And someone said, well, you don't actually have to have just one partner. If you think about partners in a law firm, if you think about partners in any kind of venture, you could have as many partners as you like. So in the first benefit, when I said, you think about the pattern, you think about the whole set as you're all partners in this endeavor, in this creation of a pattern. When I started to call positionally, I was like, why don't I call more three facing three dances? Why don't I call more dances that aren't just you and your one partner? When you split up the binary, you also invite your dancers to think differently about who is there. And it's fun because it lets you call more dances and different kinds of dances. It invites a whole new kind of category of choreography when you think about non binary partnerships. But also, it very literally makes people who identify as non binary gender feel better about their place in the dance hall. They come in and instead of replicating this traumatic experience of being told they have to pick male or female by saying, well, you have to pick Lark or Robin, or you have to pick Shoot or Ladder, you say, find two partners. We're going to do a three facing three dance. There's nothing there that replicates problematic models. And then when you do call a dance, that's just, okay, find a partner. It doesn't have any of the same baggage that it might. Making no assumptions about gender was interesting to me as a caller because it led me to collect a whole bunch of dances that also were non binary in structure. 5-person dances, 7-person dances, 6-person dances where it's three facing three, etc. Benefit 3, everyone's a potential partner. I am not a particularly social person. So I started dancing in Michigan. And I would say for the first year that I was dancing at the local contra dance in Lansing, I knew less than half the people in the room's name. And one reason for that is because I didn't talk to anybody very much. I would bring a book, I would read it at the break. But the other reason is because I only danced with half the people in the room. So suddenly it was like, okay, well, I don't know so many of you. And it's literally because I've been discouraged from partnering with you. And so for me, as a new dancer, especially trying to understand the social rules of a space, I modeled my behavior on the behavior of other people. Positional calling and getting rid of these expectations about who you partner with is partly about creating a culture for new dancers that has more positive values from the very beginning. Because callers say, we're dancing with everyone in the room. But my lived experience as a dancer when I started doing social folk dance was that I danced with half the people in the room. Positional calling, everyone is a potential partner. And again, I think this also starts to break up that idea that a partnership is a couple. Benefit number 4 is less talking, more dancing. One foundational tenet of positional calling, and this is really the idea of global terminology, is that you speak to as many people as possible with each call. So if I said one's cast and chase clockwise around the twos, it's way more efficient than first lady followed by her partner, cast down the outside and around the twos, the ones at home. I'm not massively exaggerating that example. And the idea isn't unique to positional calling. I was reading a whole bunch of Northern junkets over lockdown, and there was this really kind of grumpy article about how patter calling was falling out of style, and callers were saying you should use as few words as possible. And this argument for efficiency, which I think now, especially in English country dance calling, is fundamental. We all agree that you should be as concise as possible. So, although it was entertaining to me that in the 1950s it was like, calling is part of the fun of the evening, and we should be entertaining and verbose, not concise and efficient. Today, we generally agree that a concise walkthrough is a good walkthrough because we get to dance sooner and more of the evening. Global terminology lets us do that. For me, one of the most exciting things about switching from role-based calling to positional calling was rethinking my cards and looking at dances in a whole new way. Now, every time I dance a dance, I'm thinking, how many of us are doing a thing and how is the best way to describe who those people are? It changes the way you see the pattern. It goes back to that first benefit, dancing the whole dance, where you really think about it as a pattern and understand it in a holistic way. Benefit 5, more effective learning means better dancing. One of the reasons that I love English country dance is because as a community, we value skill, we value beauty in our dancing, we value sort of high quality, challenging dance experiences. As a caller, my goal is to offer the most enjoyable balance between teaching something very complicated and seeing dancers succeed at that complicated thing. A couple of recent experiences come to mind. One is that someone mentioned a dance and said, I've never seen that dance work. And I'm thinking, maybe that's not a great dance to teach. How many times have you seen it fail? And the other is watching someone teach a dance and using the same language again and again and having that language not work, not convey the idea. So, although again, it's not unique to positional calling, this idea of really teaching the pattern and understanding it. For me, when I work out how to call a dance positionally, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm thinking about how many different ways can I describe this, but also how do I convey the pattern in a way that any individual dancer is thinking about how they facilitate sort of the manifestation of that pattern, because that helps them remember what to do next. If they're thinking, I'm just doing a sequence of things and they are apparently completely arbitrary, they're going to remember it differently than if they think, oh, right, I circle so that I can send the ones into a hay or something along those lines. Positional calling means that you are teaching a pattern, you're teaching relationships, you're teaching a bunch of things that people are actually better at remembering than lists. Like I said, this isn't unique to positional calling. Good callers always offer dancers clues about how to recognize and remember the pattern, right? We talk about flow, we talk about momentum, we talk about accommodating other dancers with our movement. And positional calling just takes that to the next level. That's your primary goal as a caller, is to think about how do I teach the dancers to think about themselves as part of this pattern and to remember the dance that way. The result in my experience, and I should say, I didn't do much of an introduction of myself, but I've been calling positionally both Playford, English, and Contra since 2017. And my experience across the board is that people learn faster, they learn more effectively, and they dance better. That's not scientific. You could say, well, Louise, maybe you were just a worse caller 4 years ago than you are now, which is hopefully true, right? We all get better at everything all the time. But I do think it's also that positional calling made me a better caller because I taught differently, that teaching differently is in fact key to why I'm better. The last thing that I want to talk about before I open it up to conversation is the challenge of positional calling. And that challenge really boils down to the learning curve. You've probably heard a caller say that when an unusual figure is introduced, say a circle right, new dancers have an advantage over experienced ones because they don't know that they don't expect a circle right. And so circle right and circle left are equivalent experiences in their bodies. Positional calling is similar. It's easy for new callers because they're at the beginning of their learning curve on everything related to calling. So they're just learning to call. But for experienced callers who have deeply ingrained language, right? Like we probably say first corners, that's first gent and second lady, and you said it before you even thought about saying it. It just rolls out of your mouth. And so suddenly you have to be like, oh God, I can't say that. And so part of what you have is that learning curve to learn new things to say. First corners, that's the people on the right diagonal. Replacing language with new language so that your brain is like, oh, I still have something to say. And you've given it that thing. Learning something new obviously means making ourselves vulnerable to mistakes. And I think people who pride themselves on being extremely experienced, very popular, successful callers, because they're reliable, because they know their material inside and out and deeply in their bodies, and in their muscle memory, in their vocal memory, it's really anxiety producing to suddenly be like, well, I'm new at this and I'm going to make mistakes, and people are going to be angrier at me for making mistakes than they would be at a new caller because they expect me to be perfect. And I think for better or worse, we do tend to expect callers, especially callers with significant reputations, to be perfect, which is horribly unfair. Asking very experienced callers to learn something new is intimidating. One of the real advantages that we have coming out of the pandemic is that people are sort of retraining themselves, but also we have a lot of potential for new callers and new dancers. And so we have a moment where we can introduce something that's not changing the system people know, but is actually introducing them to a thing that we love with a language that is more supportive of our community values. There is an advantage, a benefit hidden inside this challenge. And the advantage to positional calling is that you don't have to change overnight. If you are an experienced caller and you're super nervous about switching from role-based calling to positional calling, you don't have to do it all at once. You can say, okay, I'm going to think about that phrase replacement. I'm going to say first corners, that's the two dancers on the right diagonal. And that's the only change I'm going to make for the first month or two or six that I call. And I'm going to see how that feels. I'm going to see how it works. This is really different from role term changes, right? Like I can't be like, okay, well, I'll just call Robin's chain and I'll do everything else gents and ladies. Like, no, that doesn't work. You can't do that. But positional calling is, I hesitate to say invisible because I think in an ideal world it's not invisible, it's intentional. But functionally speaking, it can be invisible. And so you can ease yourself into it as a caller in a way that is really forgiving and is also a way, if you're passionate about positional calling, but your community is more skeptical, it's a way to ease them into it as well. You might be like, oh, Louise, you're saying this is really hard, but actually I find it much more intuitive than role-based calling. And I love it. And my dancers, on the other hand, don't love it so much. And so how do I get them on board? Sneak it in, see how they feel, and then introduce the conversation. Say, hey, did you notice that I was using a lot of positional based teaching and people seem to be learning faster? What do you think that's about? Isn't that interesting? Don't you love the pattern of that dance, etc.? Very genuinely, I think we're in a moment where dialogue is the most important part of this conversation. See
Yeah,
some
we
comments,
have a
questions?
question, Louise, from
Sure.
Carol Ann. So Carol Ann asks, I'm not a caller, but I like to choreograph dances. I
Mm.
originally used Playford style terms and abbreviations to specify my dances, but I like instead to use positional terms to specify the dance figure. So this is about writing up the dances in a book or on whatever. Are there any resources that might be available to help choreographers who want to frame their dances, write up their dances in positional terms?
That is an excellent question. And thank you for asking it because it's something that I didn't address, but that there has also, I think, been some concern, some anxiety, and then some conversation about. The first thing I would say is obviously all the impropriety books um, are written possessionally, described using global terminology. So if you're thinking, like if you can think of a figure that's in a Brooke and Chris dance that is a figure that you want to describe and you can't figure out how to do it without role terms, go and look at their example less, far less comprehensively. Um, the choreography on my website is all described positionally. I have English and Contra on there. There are a couple other callers. Lisa Haywood is a Kaylee caller here in the UK, and she's been putting a whole bunch of dances up in positional language, with the caveat that it takes me 2 weeks to three to reply to an email. Sorry, Renee. Um, I am happy to help, and probably I don't want to volunteer Brooke's time, but if it's a quick question,
Yeah. Well, I was
it's
actually
really
going to say,
easy.
I have several people that have been sending me dances, both dances they've written and dances that they've seen, that are old dances or new dances that they want to translate, and said, how do I word this? How do I word this weird figure I've invented or whatever? And I'm delighted to geek out about it with people.
Yeah.
So
And I think
long as
the
it's
other
not,
thing
here's my
matters,
book of 500 dances, would you all translate them to positional
right?
language?
Exactly. The other thing that's really helpful, try teaching it to people. And that, again, if you have 500 dances, is not the most effective use of time, perhaps. But if you just have one dance and you're like, I know that this is possible, but I'm having trouble envisioning it. If you just get a bunch of people in a room and you start moving them around, it's amazing how you can be like, I just realized that the long second corners are the people doing that. Or I just realized that you have a shadow that would be really helpful to describe this figure. But yeah, there's a lot of resources. And the other thing, obviously, I think there's the positional calling email list that Shared Weight runs. And so um, that's a resource. There are people who aren't as visible maybe as me and Brooke, but who are also thinking about positional calling. I just had a beginning of a really great conversation with another caller here in the UK who's been thinking about calling contra positionally, and didn't even realize there were other people having that thought. until this week when a mutual friend connected us. So there are other people out there who are thinking these questions through, and who would be willing to help.
Mhm. Cool. We've got another question here that says, there are always exceptions. Don't you agree? I can call companions globally, but it does not make sense to me to call it positionally.
Can I chime in?
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
please.
Okay. To me, the term positionally means where you are now. So you call from that position. So if you see first corners, it's whoever is in
Yeah,
that position now. And that
okay.
means what the positional aspect of it means. Globally to me means speak to as many people as possible. So if
Hmm.
I can do 2 people or 4 people in a group and give them the same instruction, then I have gained not only good comprehension, it also means they don't have to rethink things when they change from a 1 to a 2 and so forth. Those are advantageous. But what I brought up in this particular instance is this particular dance is more specific to the corner people rather than corner positions. So when if you want to
Right. So
call
you're saying
to,
you want to use first corners even when they're in second corners.
that's right. And I
Yeah.
emphasized that in my instruction when I called it last, and it worked well.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that in terms of exceptions, yeah, it wasn't being called positionally from that respect.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I have
there's,
a
oh, go ahead,
much
Louise.
more
Sorry.
precise definition of positional calling than I
Right,
would ever, like, yeah, in
right.
that case, half my dances are exceptions. I would absolutely, if the first corners are going to be active multiple times, regardless of where they are, I would say first corners, you're going to do a bunch of things. You won't always be in first corner position, and then I would teach it.
That's how it works in this particular one.
The thing is that there's not one strategy. There
Yeah,
are
exactly.
multiple strategies. And so another strategy for companions would be chevroners. You will be, so instead of like first diagonals, you're now blah, blah, but just like you people just did this thing, now do this other thing. So many
Yeah,
strategies rather than like
and
semanticizing it.
that's the other thing that I was going to say, like pretty early on when positional calling became a conversation among more than 4 people in the Contra world, there were several people who were like, okay, like let's figure out substitutions. And we're just going to map sort of like there are databases of contra dances. So it's quite easy on the computer to map this phrase to that phrase. But it doesn't work because it ignores the transitions between figures. It ignores the momentum, right? It ignores all the things that are useful. It ignores the fact that you could say the people who chained across or the people who crossed the set in the chain are going to start the back to back on the diagonal or whatever is useful, right? Like, um, so key for me, and I think again, this is the learning curve thing, right? Is that I literally have rewritten every single one of my dance cards from scratch, thinking about each dance individually, because otherwise you're going to teach badly. And that's not ever my goal, regardless of what strategy for calling I'm using. So yeah, there are always exceptions. In some ways, we might even say that in positional calling, every dance is unique. There's not a rule.
Hi, Louise. Um,
Hey.
I've been mostly calling positional the last few months. We're actually dancing live where I am. Yay! And one thing I sometimes struggle with is with modern dances because they often have wonderful flow. To me, I'd like as a caller to often start by trying to get the dancers to sort of feel that as one of my things, and like say a poussette into a Mad Robin or a poussette into a gate. If I start by saying, and you're still heading, you still get your momentum, or you're heading the same direction into a clockwise gate or something. There are multiple dancers I find who I call for who somehow never can feel their momentum, never know which direction they were
Absolutely.
just going. Even if I say, well, they're still walking, do you have you met that? And have you found a way to sort of get these dancers to start learning how to feel that?
Yeah, it's interesting that you raised this because I encountered both that problem and simultaneously the problem of dancers in the UK finish a figure, come to a complete standstill, and start the next one as an aesthetic. Like that is a value that they hold as dancers. And so the momentum-based teaching is like, oh dear, you don't have any. Your whole goal is to like break the momentum. Um, which is obviously less true if the dance calls for momentum, but it does, like the first thing that you said, as a solution, right? To talk before they've stopped moving helped a little bit. And I had a moment I was calling a dance where I absolutely should have said, like, before they finish the courtesy turn, the people moving forward in that courtesy turn do X. And I have to admit that again, like I'm not a purist. And in the courtesy turn example, like there's someone on the right and there's someone on the left. And my goal is the dancers understand who should be doing what as fast as possible. I'm gonna say the person on the right, stick your right hand in. Especially in contra dance calling, I use a lot of like, two of you have a right hand free, Alamand right. In contra choreography, you learn quite quickly that you're almost always going to be the right hand free person if you are that person. And so it becomes really invisible really quickly. In English, you don't always have that the same predictability of contra choreography, although you can get, I think, tricked by predictability in contra. Often in English choreography, it's a corner, and that solves a lot of your problems straight away, right? Like, it's going to be the first corners or the first diagonal or the second diagonal. And so you can use those people, or it's the ones or the twos, or whoever it is. Like that's a moment where I think the best thing you can do as a caller is know your dance inside and out and know where everyone is all the time. And I'm not going to say like you should always have ready multiple ways to teach everything because that's not realistic, right? Like I don't have 2 ways to teach every figure of every dance I teach. But I do think that on the fly, I am quite good at being like, that didn't work. How else can I describe the people who need to move? And I know who they are. So I can do that quite quickly. And that is just practice. You know, I mean, I am so thrilled to hear that you've been calling positionally for a few months, but like a year from now, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, that used to be hard.
Maybe. I mean, the one thing I ran into, I said I said momentum and clockwise, and the tops
Mhm.
are heading toward the piano side and the bottoms are heading toward the clock side. And only like the fourth or fifth one was like, oh, I guess I need to say people in the first quarters are going to cross through the middle. You know, so sometimes
Yeah.
I'm like, I need more alternates. I only have 2 or 3. But that's
And
why
I
I was
do
wondering
think,
about momentum. But I guess that's just, you know,
yeah,
it's a typical caller problem. Every now and then you have a dancer who just, you know,
that's the
doesn't
other
get.
thing, right? And like sometimes a demo is the answer. Um, and
Okay.
yeah, that you might only discover like you teach one dance and it's like, oh, I had to do 4 different things to get people moving in the right way. But then, you know, 2 dances later in the program, you have a similar transition. And either they will have figured it out from the first one that was a bit painful, or you can be like, you know what, I'm just going to cut to the chase and do a demo of this bit and solve everybody's problem. But I also think, you know, I was calling at a festival 2 weeks ago, and so did a lot of positional calling and got a lot of feedback. Although most people didn't know that I was calling positionally and didn't really notice. So the one person who I know knew said, I think that the positional calling, like the gender freeness made it hard. And then a bunch of other people said, you're such a clear teacher. That was really, it was easier to learn from you than some of the other callers here. And I thought, yeah, none of that is actually about the way that I was calling. You know, it's about some people find my accent hard to understand in this country because I sound American and they're used to people who sound English. Um, some people, they are used to calling or they're used, oh dear, they're used to hearing certain callers. And so if they always follow one caller around or if that's their local caller, they're going to find that person easy to understand because they're used to all their quirks, right? And I could make a long list. Like there are so many reasons, and every caller has a good day and a bad day. And at the end of the day, I think yes, it's always a learning curve. Yes, we all need multiple strategies. This conversation that we're having, figure out different ways to teach the same thing. Sometimes use a demo, figure out when a demo is going to be more or less effective. Those are the same conversations I've been having in caller workshops for 20 years. It's not caller, I mean, it's not positional calling specific, but some of the strategies are different. So again, I saw that Brooke put the mailing list for the positional calling email in the chat. And it would be fantastic if that mailing list became a vibrant source of discussion and ideas. Because the other thing is that, like, my solution isn't going to be your solution because we are different, right? Like Vic was saying, every situation is unique, and every caller is also unique. Yeah.
Thanks.
As a dancer, not a caller, I I feel like a big advantage to it is to set a template where you don't have gender attributes that are considered, you know, associated with a certain gender, like regardless of what your sexuality is.
Yeah.
For me, that's always been an irritant in all aspects of life, that you enter a new venture and okay, you can't be the leader, or you know, in dance. Or,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's like multiple levels, right? Like, it's expectations about which role you're going to dance.
not that there
Which,
is a leader.
exactly. Well, I was going to say,
But-
which doesn't even make any sense in
right.
folk, right? Like, okay, I guess we're all leading each other and it's going to be chaos. Or a lot of people, mostly callers, I feel like, say callers are the leaders.
Yeah.
But yeah,
But
but also
just
for
as
me,
far
it's
as like in contra, sorry.
no, go ahead.
In contra, you know, who can give a twirl, or
Yeah, exactly.
you know, I don't know. Some people, I mean, some people feel like they need to guide their partner if they're
hmm
not exactly
Yeah, a
doing
lot of
as-
like weird kind of almost pushing
yeah,
behavior. Like, I feel so much like I have to be a lead, that I'm doing things that are not helpful.
right.
I was in a dance the other day where someone insisted on putting my right hand in for the chain. And I was like, what I really want is your left hand to bounce off, not your hand pushing my right hand forward. Like, that is um, counterproductive as an attempt to help. And so yeah, Brooke has just put in the chat the question of palms up or palms down. And like, the number of times that someone has like stopped in their tracks because I've offered a palm up or a palm down and it's not what they expect. And I'm like, could we please just hold hands and circle left? Like, um, but equally, and I have new dancers sort of really anxious, right? Like, which way should my hands be? And I'm like, the way that you can take someone else's, you know, it's a social experiment. It is a dance where we all dance together, where we're all partnering. If you offer me a hand, I'm going to accommodate your hand. In the same way that if you go somewhere I don't expect you to in the dance, I'm going to accommodate your movement rather than crash into you in a painful manner. Because which is the better outcome? But also, I mean, I wanted to follow up on the gender thing because, yeah, it's leading flourishes, it's expectations about which side of the set you line up on. It's also, for me, has been a lot of sort of unwelcome comments, right? Or behaviors. Like, I like my flirting to be consensual. I don't like it when people tell me I should be batting my eyelids at them. I don't like being told how to perform a gender that I don't necessarily fully identify with, um, or how to perform that gender in a way that is satisfying someone else's expectations rather than my own. Um, and so, yeah, uh, I think that when we get rid of gender, we make the dance space more welcoming for an awful lot of people in a variety of ways. So thank you for that comment. I was sort of curious about how many people who are here have experienced positional calling as either a caller or a dancer. Um, and yeah, people on video are putting their hands up. That's fantastic. Um, thank you, people who turn their videos on just to put their hands up. Yay. Um, and I ask that partly because I think that there is, in some ways, more conversation than experience at this stage in the dance community as a whole. And so I just want to say, particularly to callers, or organizers or dancers who want to try it, I'm always happy to have conversations about this and to think through how to make it happen. I'm happy to do workshops and things like that. Yeah, Cara is saying that she thought the pandemic, she feels like the pandemic is the right time to switch because people um, are experiencing a lot of things in new ways.
Oh, here's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great
The
question.
learning curve for callers, is there much of a learning curve for dancers?
Um,
It
in
dep-
my experience, my experience really, really, truly has been that if I don't say that I'm calling positionally, 99% of the dancers don't notice. And that is even more true in an ECD context than in a contra
Oops.
context.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, Louise, I think some people dancers equate positional calling as hard with having had the experience of an inexperienced or unskillful
Mhm.
caller. So I think it has a lot, and you alluded to this earlier, I think it has a lot more to do with the skill of the caller and the expectations and sort of community setup from the organizers than it does around the actual learning curve and choice of dances and all of those things. So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it can be, um, it can be really tempting to say, well, we're going to ask this really experienced, very skillful caller to help us explore positional calling. But you have to remember as an organizer that if it's the first time they've ever called positionally, they are a new caller for all intents and purposes. Like, yeah, they can keep time and they can, line up a set, but they are trying something that requires a kind of fundamentally different mindset. Not in every way, but in enough ways that it's not going to be representative.
Right.
Whereas if you're like, we want to try positional calling, we'll hire Brooke, who's been doing it for 30 something years, like you're going to get a solid experience, right? Like it's going to be representative of like the best that that strategy can be, which is exactly how you'd hire a caller for any other situation, right? You'd be like, we want the best caller, and your criteria might be different depending on your event. But if your criterion is positional calling done well, there are some choices that are more obvious, and I would
Yeah,
encourage you to make them.
yeah. And I thank you so much, Louise. This has been really great. I love your articulate speaking and thoughts on this. Witness my
Thank you.
unarticulate way of saying how articulate you are. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, Louise, so much. And
Thank you all for
should we
being here.
mention? So I just sent off a book on how to call dancing the whole dance positional and global strategies for ECD, teaching ECD, off to CDSS, which will be published before the end of the year. Louise is going to do one on calling contra, and then we're going to co-edit one on sort of the history, sort of past, present, and future of stuff. So be looking for those coming out soon too. Yes, yay, Louise, woohoo!
Thank you all. This was really fun. Thank you for your participation too.